At 10:22 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, 400 miles northwest of Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific Ocean, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida looked up from the bridge of the carrier Akagi and watched death falling from the sky. American dive bombers, dozens of them, peeling out of the clouds in near vertical dives with nothing between them and the flight deck below. No fighters, no anti-aircraft fire reaching them at that altitude. Nothing. The lookout scream was not a report. It was pure terror. Fuchida had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. He was the most famous aviator in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had stood in a similar position above Ford Island on December 7th and watched his nation's power demonstrated in 2 hours of controlled destruction. He had been celebrated across Japan. Newspapers printed his photograph. Children knew his name. He was a symbol of what Japanese military power could achieve when properly planned and ruthlessly executed. He was supposed to be flying today. He was supposed to be in a cockpit at the head of the strike formation, leading the attack against the American carriers that had come out to defend Midway Island. He was supposed to be doing the one thing he knew how to do better than almost anyone alive in the Imperial Navy. Instead, 48 hours earlier, acute appendicitis had bent him double in the ship's passageway and put him on a surgery table in the ship's medical bay. The surgeons cut him open and removed a ruptured organ. The wound was sewn shut with careful stitches that were already beginning to tear under the stress of standing on the bridge in a combat situation. He was told he could not fly. He was told he needed rest. He ignored both instructions. So Fuchida was on the bridge, an observer, a witness, chained by his own body to a position where all he could do was watch events unfold below him and understand their meaning. And what he was watching at 10:22 on the morning of June 4th was the complete destruction of everything Japan had built in the Pacific in the previous decade. One bomb, falling from Lieutenant Richard Best's Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, cutting through the warm tropical air toward the flight deck directly below the bridge where Fuchida stood. Fuchida could not move to stop it. He could not warn anyone who did not already see it. He could only stand on the bridge of the most powerful carrier in the Imperial fleet and watch the bomb fall and understand, with the absolute clarity that sometimes comes only in moments of total catastrophe, that this was not how it was supposed to end. This is the story of how 6 minutes destroyed the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, how a code-breaking operation conducted in a basement at Pearl Harbor defeated 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and changed the course of the Pacific War. Why the man who watched it happen spent the rest of his life trying to explain what he saw, and why the man who made the American victory possible waited 43 years after his death to receive the medal he deserved. To understand what Fuchida witnessed that morning, you need to understand what the Japanese believed about themselves in June of 1942. 6 months of unbroken victory had created something more dangerous than confidence. It had created certainty. The certainty that Japan had built a military capability so superior to its enemies that the outcome of the war had already been decided. All that remained was completing the work of making that certainty official. The Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier strike force, had demonstrated this superiority at every engagement since Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, 353 aircraft from 6 carriers had descended on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor and sunk or damaged 18 warships, destroyed 188 aircraft on the ground, and killed 2,403 Americans. Japanese losses were 29 aircraft and 64 men. The exchange ratio was not the result of superior numbers. The Japanese had achieved it through superior training, superior aircraft design, and flawless planning executed against an enemy who had not believed the attack was coming. In January and February of 1942, the same carrier force ranged through the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines, striking Allied airfields and shipping with the same overwhelming precision. In April, 5 carriers entered the Indian Ocean and destroyed the British Eastern Fleet as a functioning combat force, sinking 2 heavy cruisers, the Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and the light carrier Hermes, in operations that lasted less than 3 days. British Admiral James Somerville described fighting the Kido Butai as facing an adversary from another technological era. They could simply do things no other navy in the world was yet capable of. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, understood the danger lurking inside this success. Yamamoto had studied in America. He had visited American industrial facilities. He understood American production capacity in a way that most of his colleagues did not. Every month the war continued. American shipyards and aircraft factories closed the gap that Japanese training and preparation had opened. The first 6 months of the war had been Japan's to win. The war itself might belong to someone else. Yamamoto needed to force a decisive naval battle immediately, before American carriers multiplied, before American aircraft designs improved, before American pilots gained the experience to match the veterans who had trained in the Japanese Navy since the 1930s. He needed to destroy the American Pacific Fleet carrier force in a single engagement that would eliminate American offensive capability in the Pacific entirely, and he needed to do it soon. His plan centered on Midway Island, a tiny American outpost 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, consisting of 2 small islands surrounded by a coral reef. In strategic terms, Midway had almost no value. There were no significant resources, no major harbor, no industrial capacity of any kind. But Yamamoto correctly identified the psychological and strategic importance that the Americans would assign to it. Midway was the westernmost American position in the Central Pacific. Losing it would expose Hawaii to direct Japanese air attack. The American public and the American military establishment could not accept that. The Americans would send their carriers to defend Midway. And when the American carriers appeared, the combined fleet would destroy them. The force Yamamoto assembled for the Midway operation was the largest concentration of Japanese naval power ever gathered. 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying 272 aircraft, 2 battleships in direct support of the carriers, 4 additional battleships operating as a separate force, 7 heavy cruisers, 13 cruisers of various types, 45 destroyers, 11 submarines positioned as a picket line to detect American movements, separate invasion forces for Midway and for the Aleutian Islands as a diversionary attack. In total, nearly 200 vessels spread across multiple task groups covering millions of square miles of ocean. Against this armada, the Americans could field 3 carriers, the Hornet and Enterprise, both operational and at full strength, and the Yorktown, which had been so badly damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier that Japanese intelligence estimated she required at least 90 days of shipyard repair before returning to service. American repair crews at Pearl Harbor worked in rotating shifts around the clock for 72 hours straight, using temporary patches and emergency repairs to make her marginally seaworthy. She was not fully operational. Her repair work was incomplete. Several of her systems were still damaged, but she was at sea and she was carrying aircraft. On paper, the Battle of Midway should have been a Japanese victory. The carrier force advantage, the aircraft advantage, the tactical advantage of 6 months of combat experience against an enemy still learning how to fight. The operational advantage of attacking a target the enemy could not abandon. Everything pointed toward a Japanese victory. Everything except one factor that Yamamoto's brilliant planning had somehow overlooked: the security of his own communications. In a basement room at the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, at the naval station at Pearl Harbor, in a space so cramped and poorly ventilated that the officers who worked there had given it the nickname the Dungeon, Commander Joseph Rochefort commanded the most important intelligence operation in the Pacific War. Rochefort was brilliant in the specific way that institutional military organizations usually cannot accommodate. He was unconventional, argumentative, certain of his own conclusions, and completely unwilling to defer to seniority when he believed seniority was wrong. He worked 18-hour shifts, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, operating on coffee and willpower, surrounded by teams of codebreakers, working on intercepted Japanese naval messages. The code Rochefort's team was attacking was designated JN-25 by American intelligence. It was the primary operational cipher of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese cryptographic division had designed it using multiple layers of mathematical encryption that their analysts believed made it unbreakable within any operationally relevant time frame. They were wrong. Rochefort's team was not breaking every message. They were not even breaking most messages. But they were breaking enough fragments and assembling those fragments with enough analytical skill to reconstruct Japanese operational intentions with increasing accuracy. By April of 1942, Rochefort had identified a major Japanese offensive being planned. Intercepted traffic referenced a target designated AF. The scale of the Japanese preparations, the number of vessels involved, the timing, all of it suggested something enormous. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. He was certain of it. But certainty in the intelligence world requires evidence, not intuition, and Washington's own intelligence analysts disagreed. They believed the Japanese were preparing to strike the American West Coast or possibly Australia. AF could be any of a dozen potential targets. Without proof, Rochefort's analysis was just one interpretation among several. Rochefort needed proof that did not require breaking more code. He designed a test. He instructed the Midway garrison to transmit an unencrypted radio message visible to any listening station, reporting that the island's water distillation system had broken down. It was a simple, mundane operational message, the kind of thing small outposts reported routinely. Midway sent it in clear text. Rochefort's team waited. 2 days later, Japanese encrypted traffic began referencing AF as short on water. The message had been picked up, reported up the Japanese intelligence chain, and incorporated into their operational planning. Rochefort had Yamamoto's headquarters confirming his analysis for him through their own communications, without knowing they were doing it. AF was Midway. The debate in Washington ended immediately. Admiral Chester Nimitz received Rochefort's complete intelligence estimate. The Japanese would strike Midway between June 3rd and 5th. They would attack from the northwest with 4 carriers as the primary strike force. They expected no American carrier presence in the area. They were planning to use Midway as bait, to draw out American carriers, and then destroy them with the fleet standing by. Nimitz understood that if Japanese assumptions were correct, the plan would work. The Japanese outnumbered him in every category. He could not fight them on their terms. But Nimitz also understood what Yamamoto did not know. The Americans would not be responding to bait. They would be waiting. Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers northeast of Midway Island. Outside the search patterns, Japanese reconnaissance would fly before the battle. When the Japanese arrived expecting to find empty ocean, and then an American carrier force scrambling to defend a base under attack, they would find 3 American carriers already positioned and ready to strike. The ambush had been ambushed. The Japanese fleet approached Midway on June 3rd, under overcast skies that grounded most reconnaissance aircraft on both sides. The American submarine picket line that Yamamoto had positioned to detect American carrier movements had been set up in the wrong location. The American carriers had slipped past them days earlier. Japanese intelligence had no knowledge that American carriers were anywhere near Midway. As far as Nagumo knew, on the morning of June 4th, he was sailing toward a routine strike operation against an island garrison that had no naval support. The carriers he expected to ambush had not yet appeared. At 7:15 on June 4th, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's voice came over the radio from the first strike wave returning from Midway. The island's defenses were still intact. The airfields had taken damage, but remained operational. Anti-aircraft guns were still firing. The garrison was still fighting. A second strike would be needed to neutralize the island before the invasion force could land safely. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai from the bridge of the Akagi, faced a decision that would determine the outcome of the battle before the battle had actually started. His reserve strike aircraft, sitting in the hangars of all 4 carriers, were armed with torpedoes. They had been configured for anti-ship operations because Nagumo's operational orders required him to maintain a strike force ready to attack American carriers if they appeared. If he rearmed those aircraft with bombs for a second strike against Midway, he would be leaving himself without an anti-ship strike capability at the exact moment when American carriers might appear. His intelligence said no American carriers were in the area, but intelligence had been wrong before. Nagumo weighed the risk. His intelligence sources were reliable. The American carriers were not here. He needed to destroy Midway's defenses. He ordered the rearming. The decision was tactically reasonable, given what Nagumo knew. Given what Nagumo did not know, it was fatal. Deep below the flight decks of all four carriers, in the cramped, poorly lit hangar spaces, where the air smelled of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid and metal heated by tropical sun, Japanese aircraft mechanics began the brutal work of rearming. Removing torpedoes from aircraft required disconnecting electrical connections, releasing mechanical locks, and physically lowering the heavy weapons clear of the aircraft with block and tackle. Each torpedo weighed nearly 2,000 pounds. The bombs that replaced them were lighter, but still required careful handling. The work in the confined hangar spaces was physically exhausting. Mechanics working in temperature above 90 degrees, sweating through their uniforms, straining under the weight of weapons that could kill them if dropped. At 7:40, everything changed. A Type 95 float plane from the heavy cruiser Tone finally transmitted its contact report. The plane had been delayed 90 minutes launching due to a catapult malfunction, a mechanical failure so small and ordinary that it would not have merited a sentence in any routine maintenance log. But those 90 minutes of delay meant that the Tone's scout plane reached its search area an hour and a half late. The American carriers were already launching aircraft when the scout plane finally arrived in the area. The scout reported contact. 10 ships, American, bearing 10 degrees, range 240 miles. No further details. 10 ships could mean anything. It could mean destroyers and cruisers. It could mean a supply convoy. It could mean a carrier task force. Nagumo needed to know. He sent a message demanding clarification. The answer came back with the words that changed everything. One of the ships appeared to be a carrier, maybe carriers. The language was vague, the identification uncertain, but Nagumo could not treat an uncertain carrier sighting as no carrier sighting. If American carriers were 240 miles away, and he had just ordered his anti-ship weapons removed from his aircraft, he was in catastrophic danger. He ordered the rearming reversed. The mechanics who had spent 45 minutes removing torpedoes and installing bombs were now told to remove the bombs and reinstall the torpedoes. There was no time to follow the safety protocols that required returning all removed ordnance to the magazines and weapons storage areas below the hangar deck. Returning each torpedo to the magazine required time that did not exist. The operational situation demanded having aircraft ready to launch as quickly as possible. Bombs and torpedoes began accumulating on hangar deck floors, piled beside aircraft, pushed against bulkheads, stacked between wing racks. The explosives were not secured. Safety pins were left in place, but the weapons themselves lay on steel decking or leaned against structural supports, held in position by nothing more than their own weight and the casual confidence that nothing would happen to them. The aircraft surrounding them were fully fueled. Aviation gasoline lines ran inches from the piled ordnance. Electrical wiring that could arc in an explosion ran through the spaces where the weapons sat. This was the configuration of all four Japanese carriers at approximately 9 o'clock on the morning of June 4th, 1942. 4 ships, each carrying dozens of fueled aircraft and hundreds of tons of piled, unsecured explosive ordnance in hangar spaces designed to store weapons, not store them loosely on the floor while aircraft were fueled around them. The Kido Butai, the most powerful naval strike force in history, had accidentally constructed 4 of the most dangerous spaces in the history of naval warfare. Fuchida could see the state of the hangar decks from his position on the bridge. The surgical incision in his abdomen was causing steady pain that he managed by not moving abruptly and not thinking about it directly. His ankles ached from standing. He noted the flight decks empty of aircraft, the hangars working below, the combat air patrol circling overhead in layered formations. The tactical picture seemed manageable. The American torpedo planes that had attacked that morning had died without scoring a single hit. The Japanese strike against the American carriers was being prepared. In 45 minutes, perhaps 50, aircraft would begin rising from the flight decks and heading east to destroy the American carrier force. At 9:20, the American torpedo bombers arrived. 15 Douglas Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 launched from the carrier Hornet. They came in at 200 feet, barely above the wave tops, flying straight and level to maintain their attack geometry. flying without fighter escort because the Wildcat fighters assigned to protect them had lost contact and were searching in the wrong area. 15 aircraft, each carrying one torpedo, flying into the most formidable combat air patrol in the Pacific. The Japanese Zeros came down like hammers. They were the best carrier fighters in the world at that moment, flown by pilots who had been doing exactly this for months. They fired and the Devastators fell. They fired again and more fell. The Zeros worked systematically down the formation from the outside in, picking off aircraft with methodical efficiency. American gunners in rear cockpits fired back. Nobody in those aircraft could have believed they were surviving this. None of them did. Torpedo 8 launched 15 aircraft. 0 returned. Every pilot, every gunner, every aircraft from the Hornet's torpedo squadron was in the ocean by 9:30. No torpedo hit a Japanese ship. The attack, measured by the standard military metrics of mission success, was a complete failure. But something else had happened during those 10 minutes that would determine the outcome of the battle. The same story played out twice more across the Japanese fleet that morning. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. American torpedo planes coming in low and slow, dying against the Japanese combat air patrol in staggering numbers. Of 41 American torpedo planes that attacked the Kido Butai between 9:20 and 10:15, 37 were shot down. Not one torpedo hit a Japanese ship. The American attacks had failed by every tactical measurement. But Fuchida was watching the sky, and Fuchida noticed what the celebration on the Japanese bridges was obscuring. The Zeros had followed the torpedo planes down to wave height to make their kills. They had done their job perfectly. They had destroyed the attackers with minimal losses. And now they were all at low altitude, circling at sea level, burning fuel that would take time to replenish, miles from the fleet and thousands of feet below the altitude where dive bombers would approach. The sky above the Japanese fleet was completely empty of fighters. At 10:15, it had been full of experienced, combat-ready Zero pilots. At 10:20, after the torpedo plane attacks ended, every one of those pilots was below 1,000 feet, reaching the limits of their fuel, and out of position to defend against aircraft attacking from altitude. The price of all those American deaths was a window of perhaps 15 minutes when the Japanese carriers had no meaningful air defense. 15 minutes. It was enough. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey had been leading the Enterprise dive bomber group for over 2 hours without finding the Japanese fleet. The position information was wrong. He had flown to the expected location and found empty ocean. He had a decision to make. Turn back to the carrier, which was the doctrinally correct choice when aircraft are running low on fuel and have not found the target. Or expand the search. McCluskey expanded the search. He turned north. Below him he spotted a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, moving at high speed, cutting a white wake through the blue water. Arashi was hurrying back to the fleet after a submarine attack. McCluskey followed the wake north and found the Kido Butai. At 15,000 feet, above broken clouds that had hidden their approach, McCluskey's dive bombers and the Yorktown's dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie were already beginning their attack runs. They had climbed above the clouds while the torpedo planes died below. They had reached attack altitude unseen, unreported, and completely undetected by the Japanese combat air patrol that was occupied at sea level. The Zero pilots circling at 1,000 feet could not see dive bombers at 15,000 feet through broken cloud cover. The radar that might have detected high-altitude aircraft did not exist on Japanese carriers. The lookouts scanning the horizon for surface contacts and low-altitude aircraft had not thought to look straight up. At 10:22, Lieutenant Richard Best rolled his Douglas Dauntless into its attack dive. Best was targeting the Akagi, the flagship, the largest carrier in the fleet. He released his 500-pound bomb at approximately 2,500 feet, pulled out of the dive and watched. Behind and above him, the rest of the Enterprise and Yorktown dive bombers were already in their dives, falling toward the Kaga and Soryu in a near-simultaneous attack across the Japanese line. Fuchida watched Best's bomb fall. He watched it from the moment it separated from the aircraft. He had perhaps 4 seconds between the moment he saw it release and the moment it hit. 4 seconds is enough time to understand what is happening. It is not enough time to do anything about it. The bomb punched through the flight deck adjacent to the midship elevator. It detonated in the upper hangar. The explosion was blinding from the bridge. The shockwave hit Fuchida physically, lifting him from the deck and throwing him against the bridge bulkhead with enough force to knock the breath from his body. He hit the steel with his shoulder and fell to the deck. He struggled to his knees. His abdomen was tearing. Something in his ankles had cracked on impact with the deck. And then the chain reaction began. The bomb had detonated in the exact space where the reversed rearming had left ordnance piled on the hangar floor, where torpedoes sat on steel decking, where high-explosive bombs leaned against bulkheads, where fueled aircraft stood in rows with fuel lines connecting them to the ship's aviation fuel system. One detonation among all of that. The initial explosion was large but survivable. What followed it was not. Aviation fuel ignited in sheets. Aircraft with full fuel tanks became secondary explosions. Each secondary explosion reached the piled ordnance nearby. Torpedoes that had been designed to survive combat handling and normal storage conditions had not been designed to survive the heat of a burning hangar. They began to cook off. Each torpedo detonation triggered adjacent detonations in a cascading sequence that the ship's firefighting systems could not approach closely enough to suppress. Fuchida pulled himself back to the bridge railing. His ankles were not working properly. He gripped the railing and looked out across the water. To starboard, a column of black smoke was rising from the carga. The same thing had happened to her. To port, another column of smoke rose from the Soryu. The same thing. 3 carriers, hit within seconds of each other by dive bombers that their combat air patrol had been unable to intercept because the combat air patrol had been occupied at sea level, destroying torpedo planes that had died without scoring a hit. The math of the exchange was not what either side would have chosen. 37 American torpedo plane crews died to create a 15-minute window in Japanese air defenses. 49 American dive bomber crews survived to fly through that window. 3 Japanese fleet carriers were mortally wounded in the 6 minutes that followed. The arithmetic was brutal in every direction. Admiral Nagumo stood at the center of the Akagi's bridge and stared at nothing. The staff officers around him were moving, making reports, receiving messages, attempting to coordinate a damage control response. Nagumo stood apart from the activity, separated from it by something that had broken inside him in the moment the bombs hit. The man who had commanded the most successful carrier strike force in history, who had planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor with textbook precision, who had led the Kido Butai through 6 months of unbroken victory, could not process what was happening to his fleet. He had been trained to attack. He had been trained to plan. He had not been trained for this. Fuchida moved toward the nearest hatch leading to the hangar deck. He needed to reach the damage control parties. The heat stopped him 15 feet from the hatch. Crew members came out of the smoke, faces blackened, clothes burned, hands so blistered they could not hold equipment. They reported conditions below that were beyond damage control. The fires were in the ordnance. The fires were everywhere. The order came eventually. Abandon ship. The Akagi was no longer a warship. She was a burning building. The crew moved to evacuate. Fires had cut off normal exits. Fuchida and the bridge officers used knotted ropes to descend. Fuchida grabbed a rope. His hands, weakened by blood loss from the torn surgical incision, could not maintain a firm grip. He reached the main deck. Another explosion hit the ship, and the blast wave threw him sideways. He lost the rope. He fell. Both ankles broke on impact with the deck. Sailors dragged him to the ship's side. They lowered him on ropes to the light cruiser Nagara, which had pulled alongside to take off survivors. Fuchida landed on the Nagara's deck and collapsed. He could not stand. His ankles were shattered. His abdomen was hemorrhaging through the torn stitches of his appendectomy incision. He was 48 hours post-surgery, bleeding internally with broken ankles, lying on the deck of a ship watching the Akagi burn. As the Nagara pulled away, Fuchida pulled himself upright against the railing. He needed to see. He needed to understand what had happened so completely that he could never be uncertain about it. He looked back at the Akagi. She was burning from end to end. The flight deck had collapsed in sections. Flames poured from the elevator shafts. Smoke rose in a column that could be seen from 50 miles away. Men were still jumping from her sides, dropping into the ocean, tiny figures against the enormous background of fire and steel. Around the Akagi, the Kaga and Soryu burned with the same intensity. 3 carriers, each representing years of construction and decades of accumulated knowledge and training, burning simultaneously in the same patch of ocean where Yamamoto's planning had said the American Pacific Fleet would die. Later that afternoon, the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, launched a strike that hit the Yorktown twice and left her dead in the water. It was the Kido Butai's last meaningful offensive action of the battle. American dive bombers found the Hiryu within hours and hit her with 4 bombs in the same 6-minute pattern that had destroyed the other 3 carriers. She burned through the night and sank the next morning. The Yorktown, already damaged beyond full repair, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine 2 days later and sank on June 7th. The price for Midway on the American side was 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 107 aircraft, and 307 men. The price on the Japanese side was 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men. Among the Japanese dead were 110 of the most experienced carrier airmen in the world, pilots who had trained for years to reach their proficiency and could not be replaced within any realistic time frame. Maintenance specialists and aircraft mechanics whose knowledge of the fleet's aircraft and systems had been built over careers. The Kido Butai that had struck Pearl Harbor did not exist anymore. The man who made the American victory possible received nothing for it in the moment when it mattered. Commander Joseph Rochefort was immediately recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal by Admiral Nimitz, who understood exactly what Rochefort's team had accomplished. Washington denied the recommendation. The intelligence officers in the Navy Department, who had been wrong about the Japanese target, who had insisted AF was the American West Coast, were not prepared to acknowledge that an eccentric commander in a basement who worked in a bathrobe had been right when they had been wrong. The recommendation was resubmitted. It was denied again. Within months of the greatest intelligence victory in American naval history, Rochefort was reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. It was a posting so deliberately insulting that even his colleagues who disagreed with him understood the message. He was being punished for being right at the expense of people who had the authority to punish him. He served out his naval career without recognition for what he had accomplished. He died in 1976, his contribution to the Battle of Midway still officially unacknowledged. In 2012, 36 years after his death and 70 years after the battle, the Navy awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal that Admiral Nimitz had recommended in June of 1942. The citation was accurate. The timing was not. Rochefort had been dead for more than 3 decades when Washington finally acknowledged that he had been right. Fuchida survived. His broken ankles required months of hospitalization. The Akagi burned for 18 hours before Japanese destroyers torpedoed her to prevent American capture of her wreckage. The Kaga and Soryu were scuttled the same afternoon. In the decades after the war, Fuchida wrote extensively about Midway. His accounts became primary sources for historians studying the battle. They were also partially unreliable in ways that historians have carefully documented. He claimed that Japanese carriers were 5 minutes from launching their strike aircraft when the bombs hit. Japanese operational logs showed at least 45 minutes remained before the strike could have been airborne. He described himself as having perceived the danger in the empty sky above the fleet, having understood in the moment what the departure of the combat air patrol to low altitude meant for the fleet's defense. Historians have questioned how much of this perception was genuine and how much was retrospective construction. The empty sky was real. Whether Fuchida understood its tactical implication in real time, standing on the bridge with a torn surgical incision and broken ankles, is unknowable. What is certain is what the Battle of Midway accomplished beyond the immediate destruction of 4 carriers. It eliminated the offensive initiative that Japan had held since December 7th. It killed an irreplaceable generation of Japanese carrier airmen. It demonstrated that American intelligence could provide advantages that tactical superiority could not overcome, and it changed the fundamental question of the Pacific War from whether America could survive to how long victory would take. Rochefort's team had provided the knowledge. Nimitz had provided the operational response. McCluskey had made the decision to extend his search rather than turn back. The men of the torpedo squadrons had died in a way that created the window through which the dive bombers flew. Every element was required. Remove anyone and the outcome changes. Rochefort's code breaking without McCluskey's decision to continue searching finds nothing. McCluskey's extended search without the torpedo planes clearing the combat air patrol to low altitude finds a sky full of zeros. This is the architecture of the Battle of Midway. Not a single decisive moment, but a chain of decisions, sacrifices, mechanical failures, and human choices stretching back weeks to a basement in Pearl Harbor, and forward through every minute of June 4th until the bombs hit. Fuchida stood at the end of that chain, on a burning ship, watching the consequences accumulate around him, understanding that everything had been determined before a single aircraft was launched. That is what he was witnessing at 10:22. Not just the destruction of 4 carriers, but the result of weeks of work that had positioned the pieces precisely. The codebreakers in the basement, the admiral who believed the intelligence, the torpedo squadron crews who flew into the zeros, knowing they were unlikely to return, the dive bomber pilots who found the fleet and began their dives from 15,000 feet through empty sky that had been purchased at enormous cost. Fuchida would later write that watching the Akagi burn felt like watching the end of something that could not be rebuilt. He was describing a ship. He was also describing an era. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway represented the maximum expression of what Japan's military preparation had achieved. The years of training, the years of strategic planning, the years of building carriers and aircraft and cultivating pilots, all of it had produced the Kido Butai at its peak. And the Kido Butai at its peak had been destroyed in 6 minutes by bombs falling from the sky into hangar spaces full of ordnance that should never have been there. The war continued for 3 more years after Midway. Japan built new carriers. They trained new pilots. They fought fierce defensive battles across the Pacific. But the offensive capability that had made them dangerous was gone. The initiative was gone, and everyone in both navies understood it, though the full implications took time to manifest. Fuchida understood it immediately. He understood it lying on the deck of the Nagara with broken ankles and a hemorrhaging abdomen, watching the flagship burn behind him. The invincible armada was gone. What replaced it would fight bravely and die in large numbers and lose. If this story reached you the way it reaches us every time we go back to June 4th, 1942, do us a favor right now. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who have never heard Rochefort's name, who have never heard about the 41 torpedo planes and what their sacrifice accomplished, who have never heard that the man who cracked the Japanese code and saved the Pacific Fleet was punished for it, with a reassignment to a floating dry dock. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We find these buried stories every single week. Stories about the basement that beat the Empire. Stories about the torpedo squadrons that died so dive bombers could live. Stories about the medals that arrived 70 years late. Every story matters. Every name matters. Drop a comment right now. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific. Tell us if you've read about Midway before and what you thought you knew that this story changed. This community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of making sure these names are not forgotten. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure that Joseph Rochefort, who worked in a basement in a bathrobe and slippers and cracked the code that saved the Pacific Fleet, is not remembered only as the man Washington punished for being right. He deserved better from the institution he served. He deserves to be remembered accurately by the people who come after. And now, because you watched this, he will be.